Welcome to Syntax. Today we have Aaron Francis on today, and he's done something either amazing or awful. We're going to figure it out, but he's figured out how to put PHP inside of JavaScript. You didn't think JavaScript was bad enough? He figured out how to put PHP inside of it. So we're really excited to have him on to talk about why and how and all of this good stuff. It's called Laravel Fusion. So welcome, Aaron. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope we get to the bottom of it. I don't know which is sullied worse, PHP by having JavaScript or JavaScript by having PHP. So yeah. we can find out together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly makes enough people mad, I can tell you that.
Yeah, it sure does. I went into the Reddit comments and quickly regretted that. So
man,
the classic.
Well, give us an introduction of who you are and what you do for anyone who's not familiar.
Yeah, sure. So I am historically a Laravel developer. My friend Steve and I started a company called Try Hard Studios almost a year ago. We're coming up on a year now.
Nice.
And what we've done over there is so far database education. So we've done, a course on SQLite and on Postgres. And so we make a lot of videos, but I am and always have been a Laravel developer. And so that's kind of where this came out of, this library we're going to talk about.
What did you do in PHP before Laravel?
I picked up ASP.NET when I was like 10 or 11 or 12, and then was like, oh, this is weird, and switched to PHP. And since then, it was raw PHP for a super long time. And then in like maybe 2010 or 11, I picked up a framework that is impossible to say out loud, Yii. Y-I-I, Yii. And I picked up Yii, and it was good. It was like one of the early MVC frameworks over on the PHP side. I did Yii for a little bit, did Cake PHP for a minute, and then picked up Laravel at like 5.1 or 2 or 3, something like that. So pretty early on, found my way to Laravel, and I've been there ever since.
Wow. I've never heard of Yii, and I feel like I've heard of most PHP, like expression engine and all those things back in the day. Wow, Yii. Interesting.
Yeah, that's a fun one to say. I like that. We should bring
Oh,
that
it's
back.
So hard to say out loud. It's like Yii. Yii? Yeah. So
Yii.
That was the main reason I abandoned it. I couldn't tell anybody what I was working on. So.
Oh, that's great. So you are working on Laravel Fusion, which give us the pitch for what that is.
Well, for trademark purposes, Wes, it's called Fusion for Laravel.
Oh,
Lest Taylor listen and come after us, of course. You know how litigious he is. I don't think he cares even one bit. So Fusion. Okay, so in the Laravel ecosystem, we've got these two great ways to interact with your front end. We've got Laravel Livewire, which is spiritually similar to like Phoenix Live View, maybe similar to something like HTMX or Hotwire. There are some fundamental differences, but that is like the closest spiritual ancestor to Livewire. And then on the other side, the JavaScript heavy side, we've had something for a long time called Inertia. And Inertia was originally written by Jonathan Rennick, who now works at Tailwind Labs. And Inertia was recently folded into Laravel Inc. So it is now a first-party Laravel package. So I looked at Inertia, which is wonderful, and Fusion is built on top of Inertia. I looked at Inertia and thought, what if Inertia went way beyond the bounds of what is reasonable? Like, what if it went beyond its mandate by like 4 or 5 miles? And that's where Fusion landed. So my business partner, Steve, is a JavaScript guy. He loves Vue. He loves Nuxt. He loves all of that stuff. And when we started working together, he kind of opened my eyes to some of the rough edges that Inertia and Laravel still had. And we were like looking at the JavaScript communities with like React server components and all that kind of stuff and thinking, remix and papering over the network even more and thinking, wow, I wonder if we could do that here. And so that was kind of like the birth, the genesis story of Fusion.
We honestly said that maybe 6 months ago. I'm like, who's going to make the React server components that is not JavaScript on the back end?
Yeah, right.
Is it fair to say that this is that? Like React server components, or like being able to both fetch and call functions from PHP, or sorry, that live in PHP backend, but from the UI that's built in JavaScript?
Yes, that is very fair. And to the extent that it's not fair, it's because I'm not there yet. So let's say that is definitely the vision for it. So as I'm observing from the outside. I've been a Vue user since, Vue 1. I've always loved Vue. I found that it clicks with my brain very well. I'm still Options API because I'm like an old back-end developer, and I'm like, this looks nice. I love this object. And so kind of like an old head there. But as I've observed the React community from the outside, I've noticed that they're just like dancing back and forth across front end, back end, all over the place. And I think some of those ideas are really great in terms of being able to compose across the network. I think some of those ideas are confusing to me, and that may be because I'm not steeped in it, or again, it may be because I'm old, but I don't like not knowing very like at a glance where my code is running. Sometimes it's on the front end, sometimes it's on the back end, but don't serialize this, otherwise you'll shoot yourself in the foot. It's like, that feels weird to me. And so I took what I thought were the great ideas from something like Next, where you can have front end and back end kind of play together, and left out some of the things that I personally found confusing, which is like, where does the code run? And that's kind of like what informed the design of Fusion.
I like that because, with all the new React stuff, it does feel like a large part of training is making sure that people understand where the boundaries are, right? And making that explicit is, I think, a good idea.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I wrote some code on Friday where I wrote like a provider that was injected on the server, but it turned out, luckily I didn't deploy it, but it turned out I accidentally put about 7 megs of server code loaded in the browser, And like that's a problem that can happen.
It's not
That's
great.
a problem
it's
that
not
can
great.
happen. Yeah. So I've noticed that it feels very single file component, right? Which obviously Vue, very single file component. Svelte, very single file component. We'll talk about like the React stuff in a little bit, but like, is the intention here for this to always be single file component, regardless of what framework you're using?
So that is definitely one of the hooks. I am not under the illusion that a single file is always going to be the right idea. So right now it does operate out of a Vue single file component with a Vite plugin that does a ton of work to get it out of there. I think what I am assuming is the best practice here is that you're treating this PHP block inside of your Vue single file component, you're treating that PHP code as a very thin controller, in that you are translating from HTTP into the bowels of your application. And so your business logic can live in, we used to call them service classes. Now we call them actions. It can live in a single PHP class that's like publish podcast. And in there, you've got all your logic and you're calling out to these providers and whatever. But from your controller, you're just like translating the user input into some sort of known structure, a DTO or something, and then handing it off. And so I think the single file component pattern can go a long way if you treat the PHP block as a thin controller rather than a super fat controller. So your logic will have to go somewhere else.
Yeah, it's like you quickly look at it and it follows a similar pattern, which I like, is if you open a file, it should tell you what does it do very quickly. And then you can click through to the rest of the code base to figure out how does it do it.
Yes, totally. Because you might, that's just one instance of translating input into action, right? You could have CLI, you could have webhook, you could have API, you could have all these other things. And so to have that logic extracted somewhere, and then this single file component is basically your HTTP endpoints and your template that goes to the front end, that feels like one, concern that goes together, and then the other stuff lives elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so let's talk about like how it actually works. Like visually, you load up the component and you have a PHP tag inside of that. But let's say you have a Vue app, which is you want to load some data, but you also want to have like a mutation where you like type into a box and search for something. How do you go about exposing the functionality from PHP and then connecting it to your JavaScript UI?
There are a couple principles here, and they'll probably be very familiar but have different names in different ecosystems. You've got state and behavior, right? So on the back end, you can define some state. So you can say, here's the list of podcasts. Please get that to the front end somehow. And you can say like, here is a search method. Please get that to the front end somehow, right? So that's your PHP block. You've got some state and a little bit of behavior. Then what happens is Fusion has, and maybe is primarily, a Vite plugin. Before it's handed over to the Vue single file component compiler, it extracts that PHP block. And it does a lot of introspection and stuff we can talk about later, but it writes that PHP to the disk. And so then you have like a fully formed PHP class on the disk. So already Fusion is trying to get out of the lifecycle and hand the lifecycle back over to plain old Laravel. And so one way we do that is at build time, we do a ton of stuff. And then at runtime, we don't do very much. And so we write that file to disk. And so at that point, we have knowledge of what is in that PHP, both exposed methods and exposed state. And what we can do is that Vite toolchain is still running. And so now that we have that information, we can inject a few pieces of data into what is going to be the compiled Vue component. And so what we can do is we can say, all right, because I have full control over this PHP, I noticed they exposed a string called search, an array called podcasts, and a function called search. And so probably wouldn't name them the same thing. That's fine. But we can see that they have exposed all of that, and we can inject those keys into the Vue component. And then at runtime, the PHP will run, we'll do some stuff, and we'll send down those keys. And the Vue component already knows to expect those keys because we wrote that in at build time. And so then we've kind of like combined everything together. And at that point, it becomes a very standard request response lifecycle with just a little bit of like, hey, we know the structure here, so we can do a little bit of magic.
Like, how is it actually working? Is it a JSON API that's sending the data back? Is it server rendered?
So on the first, on the initial load, so it does sit on top of Inertia. And so I won't assume any Inertia knowledge for the listener, but I will explain it a little bit. So on the first load, what happens is, so a request comes in, we match the URI to some component, right? And what we have there is we've got a PHP class that has been written to disk. We've got a PHP class, and what it is going to do is return basically an Inertia response, which is, it says, hey, here's the front end component that you should go look up. Here's the JavaScript component. And here's all the data that you should use to populate it. So on the first request, the data is all coming down. And so there's no like load the Vue component and then fetch the data and wait for it to all come in. It just all comes down in that first response. And then after that, it's basically as if they're API endpoints with a little bit more knowledge. And so the more knowledge is the fact that both the front and back end are aware of the state. And so the front end can like hang on to some state, modify it, do a bunch of stuff, and then basically say, hey, here's all the state for the back end, do your thing again. And so we're kind of passing around this state that we're both aware of, but you can also just reach into the back end and just call a function as if it were an API endpoint, regardless of state. So that's kind of the life cycle.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a lot of people want that experience as well, is instead of having to make an endpoint, I just want like what we call RPC, I want to be able to call a server function directly from the client side. And of course, you have to add your auth and all that stuff in between there. I'm assuming that's not a problem. But that's really nice when you're just building a single app. You don't have to fuss. The old default used to be like build an API at first and then build the UI that sort of interacts with all of that. And then it was build a GraphQL API on top of that. And now we're all the way back to just call the function from the UI, which I really like.
Yeah, and it's nice that you get all the Laravel lifecycle, the middleware, you get all of that. So it's not like, man, that I think really sells it pretty hard for me, because it's not this whole new thing. It's not like so many of these JavaScript frameworks come out and they're a good first start. But Laravel is such an established beast that you can just attach onto that, and it feels like this is. Man, it feels like this is very powerful because of that, in addition to being powerful on its own. That's really cool.
That's my hope. My hope is that, I try to defer to Laravel for everything, which informs some of the build decisions and some of that. My hope is that people will see this, people in the JavaScript community will see this and realize like, oh, I can still have the full power of my Vue front end and, eventually my React front end or my Svelte front end. We'll get there eventually. I can still have that full power. I can still like reach over the network with no effort on my own. But then when I get there, I get back into a fully like batteries included framework that can and does do everything. Because I think one of the things that I view from the outside is with something like Next.js, it started on the front end and then they have been working towards the back end, and then you reach over into the back end and you're there, and it's kind of like that John Travolta meme looking around in the room and you're like looking around and you're like, now what do I do? Where's all the stuff? How do I do a cron job? How do I do a queued command? How do I send an email? And so my hope is that by like putting Laravel as that back end, that will entice people to say like, create your incredibly rich experiences on the front end with a rich experience on the back end as well. So we'll see if I get there, but that is the hope.
Yeah. And is the idea that people are building their entire app and UI in JavaScript, or is the idea that you're still building most of it in Laravel and templating on the server, and then you're just opting in component by component to this?
So with something like Fusion, you wouldn't opt in component by component. You could opt in route by route. So you could say like, all my admin area is, Vue on the front, but all my marketing is just Blade, which is our, templating language. So you could absolutely do that, but you wouldn't have a situation where you're like, this page is a Vue page and, these components are Fusion components. Right now, Fusion just operates at the page level. So you hit a route, we return a page, and then your subcomponents on the front end, those are just Vue components. I have an idea to where every Vue component could have its own little API backend thanks to Fusion, but we're definitely not there yet.
That makes a lot of sense to me though, because you'd often have your SEO required marketing pages that don't need the high level of interactivity, can just be even just straight up backend code returning HTML. So you don't, to me, that makes a lot of sense.
And because it is built on top of Inertia does have robust support for SSR. And so it's probably just a half step for Fusion to hook into that. It might not even be a step at all. It might work right now. I haven't tried it. So there's a future where, Inertia plus Fusion has full SSR support and you can get away with that. But yeah, if you don't want to do that, you still have the choice to route things manually if you want.
That makes sense. I'm curious to see how that whole, should we do it at a component level, plays out, because that's the conversation that is forever going in the JavaScript community of, if you attach your data fetching and your functionality at a component level, you can run into like waterfall issues where like something requests another thing and then it requests another thing. And Next gets around that by using streaming, but then there's some limitations there. And then like React Router, Svelte Kit, it says only at a page level are we going to be doing these types of things. And that's kind of annoying. So
I know.
I'm curious. I'm watching.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I have not I come up with an elegant solution for yet is let's say we're in the podcast land where we've got, podcast index and each row is a podcast component, right? The standard pattern is like props down, events up, right? And so at the page level, you've got all your podcasts and you feed them down, and those props are, at least in Vue, immutable. And if you want to do anything, you emit an event, you change the data up top, and you pass new props down. So what happens if, your podcast row component has its own little API and it can toggle favorite, unfavorite? Then am I mutating the prop, or am I emitting an event that's like, hey, here's the new podcast, hand it back to me? Like, that feels weird. So that's the thing that I'm like, well, what happens if you change data that was passed down via prop? Who knows? So I haven't found something elegant there yet.
That was sort of my next question as well, is like, how does like invalidation or caching work? But I watched the demo, like some of it is you have like a whole like pending state, right? Successful state. But if you were to need to invalidate some data, what does that look like? You refresh refresh the page or recall it?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll answer it as if I did,
right.
and then you can tell me where I went astray. Right. So on the first load, the data comes down, right? So you've got, let's say, query, which is a blank string, and podcasts, which is an array. On the front end, if you vmodel to query and then you type in syntax, and you're searching for the syntax podcast, you type in syntax. No requests have been sent to the back end yet. All the vmodel stuff, everything is living on the front end. So you're syncing state on the front end, and Vue's keeping track of reactivity, and now query on the front end says syntax, even though it came down as a blank string from the back end. Then what you do is you hit, let's say you hit the search button, and you can tie the action fusion.sync, which is a magic action provided by us. You can tie that to the button. And what fusion.sync will do is it will take all of the state that it knows about, which in this case is, query string and podcast, and it'll say, all right, let's send that to the back end. Let's instantiate that as state on the back end, and let's run through their PHP again and send the data out to the front end. And then the data comes back out with, presumably the search applied, and now the podcasts array is just the one syntax podcast, and Fusion does its work to update the page. And so there's no magic caching or anything that goes on there. That's all done via just post requests back and forth to get new stuff. Now, if you Command R and hit refresh and refresh the page, it's just going to run from an initial state again, which will send down a blank query and all of the podcasts. So I answered a question. Now the question for you is, did I answer the question?
I think so. I'm just trying to think. If you were to favorite one of those podcasts, you have a list of 10 of them, and you were to favorite it, or something about one of those podcasts were to change. What you're explaining is that there's a sync that it will be able to go back to the back end and get the new array of data. Mm-hmm. Or if I were to delete one of those podcasts, what does that look like? Is that a full page reload, or is that just a sync call to the back end?
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be full page reload at all. So let's say that you do delete, you have a method in your PHP called delete enemy podcasts. And so you delete all the podcasts from the other podcasts that are terrible, right? And we're just leaving syntax. Now what happens then is after that method, so you have a button on the front that says delete. Yeah. And so then we will, and maybe you pass in, a param, an ID or something. We call that on the back end, which on the front end, it's just a little thin shim with a few pointers that say hey, here's the name of the method. Go find it when you get back there. Once we get back there, we validate that you're allowed to call that method, and then we run that method. And then after that, that state is all synced up again. So let's say that podcasts is a piece of state. So it's in parlance, it would be a computed property, right? And so then after that delete method is run, we recalculate the state, which includes podcasts, and send it back out to the front. Okay. And so then, because Vue is reactive, everything reacts, and that just one podcast row goes away.
Okay. Awesome. That's similar to how SvelteKit works as well. Yeah. Where they'll recompute it, send it back to the client, and then the whole page will re-render. In Next.js land, it can get a lot more complicated, where you can tag things as well. There's two ways. There's deprecated cache and unstable cache. There is no current cache.
Both sound amazing. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Naming.
There's nothing that's stable right now. But there's this idea that you can invalidate tags. Tanstack Query also has this, where you can invalidate tags, and anything that is tagged with that will refetch and re-render. But it gets pretty complicated.
Things I have thought about would be maybe marking some functions as pure, don't send me state, and I'm not going to send you state. This is an API only endpoint. I've thought about doing that. That seems totally useful. I've also thought about, because I do have this little, in the PHP land, I've got this little helper object, which is the pending response that is being built up by Fusion. I've thought about saying you can chain off of that and say, sync only whatever, this piece of state, because perhaps you're doing something and you don't want to go back to the database to get the podcasts again, because as the very smart developer, this method doesn't change podcasts, it changes something else. So leave podcasts alone on the front end and just sync this little piece of state. So I've thought about doing that as well. And then, of course, we've got, let's say, you just want to cache the podcasts. You could do that in Laravel. That's not HTTP caching. That would be, backend caching only. But you could offload some of that as well. So there's still a lot of options, several of which are murky. But I do like the idea of giving the developer fine-grained control over what state is being synced on what methods, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Even like another one might be like an add to cart, You add something to cart, but you want to refresh not the item, you want to refresh like the number of items in the cart or the total, something like that.
And if you want to see all of the errors in your application, you'll want to check out Sentry at sentry.io/syntax. You don't want a production application out there that, well, you have no visibility into in case something is blowing up and you might not even know it. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Again, we've been using this tool for a long time and it totally rules. All right. I think about like optimistic UI too. Like maybe you're sending that information to the back end. You just want to update the UI and revert it if it failed for some reason, just to get that instant response. Is optimistic UI anything that you've thought about, or even a problem that this has?
The way that I've thought about that, this is another me observing from the outside. And so I think my observational powers are very high. This is not one that like speaks to my soul, this optimistic UI. But I know that it is important.
Same.
And so the way that I have thought about it is when you define a function on the back end that should be exposed to the front end, you get a function on the front end with the same name. So let's say in PHP, you expose a method called favorite. In your JavaScript, you've got a function called favorite. Now, this function in Vue land is pretty powerful because it is it's a reactive proxy itself. And so you could say favorite.processing and you get back a reactive variable that says true or false. And so you can see loading indicators. And so you can do all kinds of stuff on that, or you can just call the function itself and it'll reach into the back end and accomplish that purpose. Now, a lot of the demos I've shown have been purposefully simplistic, where it's just like, you can just use it in your template. Like, it's just there. It's magical. And I think that makes a great demo. The immediate question is like, what if I need to still write JavaScript? And I'm like, yes, that is the point. I'm here to give you like JavaScript superpowers, not try to take away JavaScript from your Vue, because that makes no sense to me. So what you can do is you can say, like in your script setup, which is a Vue thing, or just in your script tag, which is also, Vue has a couple different ways to do it. You can say like, I want to import that favorite function. So instead of just relying on Fusion to do it in the template, I want to import it. And then what you can do is you can wrap it, right? So you can wrap it and say like, I'm going to import Fusion's version of the favorite function, but I'm not going to expose it to my template. Instead, I'm going to expose a function called favorite. So it feels similar, that internally does some optimistic UI, then sends off the request. And if it doesn't, if it comes back as a 200, I'm done. If it comes back as a 400, I'll revert. But you can wrap that up and then do anything you want. So my goal is to not like infer or intuit what the optimistic update would be, but rather give you the ability to accomplish that update by yourself.
That makes sense. Like you just give us the button, not the button, but the action, as we would call it in React land. And of course that can be something you hook up straight away to the button. Yep. Or it can be just one part of a larger function, which you're doing. You likely...
In Laravel or OOP in general, we would say you would decorate it. So you could decorate that action by wrapping it and putting your own little logic around it to observe the state and see the response code and all of that. But now you are in control of what happens before, during, and after that request.
So let's talk about React and other approaches. So obviously you did Vue first as a v.1. Is React scheduled? Do you want to do that?
So do I want to do that? Yes, 100%. As much as I love Vue, I also am able to observe the market and understand what's going on out there. So yes, React is definitely coming. Laravel Cloud, for goodness sakes, uses full-on React. And that's what Laravel was the one that originally turned me on to Vue. And so if Laravel's using full-on React, we got to listen up. So yes, React is definitely on the way. I have a little Slack group of people that are like really like excited about Fusion, and a few of them in there have already started hacking away at like, what is a React flavored thing, like style of this? Because I'm under no illusions that I could figure out the pattern that React developers would look at and say, yes, that makes sense to me. Because React developers, as I have seen, look at Vue single file components and they're like, heresy. Can you imagine one component per file? And I look at it and I'm like, that makes sense to me. I know, it feels awesome. So I am actively exploring React. I've got a few very smart people that are helping, and it's going to be different. Like, it's going to be fundamentally different because it's JSX, and there's a idea to use a tagged template literal to write your PHP instead of this weird little PHP block because it's not a single file component setup. And so there's a lot of things to figure out. But of course, my dream is to have the major JavaScript front-end frameworks covered so that we can welcome them into the Laravel community.
Interesting. So I'm curious to dig at like what the possible IDs are. So you said a tag template literal with like PHP in front of it is one of the ideas. What are the other ones? Is there a use PHP?
There was a used PHP.
Okay.
Yep.
What are people thinking about that?
I don't know if that was sincere or hysterical. Yeah, I can't tell. I'm not the best judge of like when someone's being serious. I always think like, oh, if they said it, they mean it. So I can't really tell. But I like, just for the lulz, the use PHP. I think probably the tagged template literal is going to win out. But I don't know, because I'm not like steeped in React world. And so I don't know like what people will look at and not be totally appalled by. I don't know if I'll ever get to acceptance, or at least not quickly, but not having a visceral vomit reaction would be a good step one, I think.
Yeah, it's tough when you don't have the single file component to, because I like that flow so much as somebody who primarily writes Svelte code. There's so many like nice things that come out of it, like the scoped CSS and being able to say this PHP code is directly for this component. So
exactly,
I've always kind of wished that there was a React single file component that would gain popularity flow, but it just doesn't seem to catch on. I remember Swix was trying to make something happen with that a little while ago. Never caught on. You had mentioned in the documentation that there was an original bad name for Fusion. Are you capable of sharing with us what that is?
Sure. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not very good. It was called Duo. And so I had originally, I wrote a package just right before I wrote Fusion, and it was called Solo. And in an abundance of creativity, I thought, well, this combines two things. We shall call it Duo. And I kept writing it, and I was like, Duo kind of sucks. It's a stupid name. And so I reached out to a couple friends, and Josh Siri was like, Fusion. And I thought, that's it. That's the one. But perfect. Duo, when it's you get in this world where it's like, it means this, and it's got this backstory and this lore. And then you go to show people, and they're like, it's called Duo? I hate it. So yeah, we changed it to Fusion.
I love it. What was the Google had a Duo that lasted?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, a whole month or something.
Yeah. If I had to name something, I would name it after a Google product because I'm pretty confident it'll go away and it'd be totally fine.
Be available. So. Yeah, totally.
I'm still chewing on this, like what the React API would look like, and I often when server components came out, I was like, wouldn't it be cool to still use the same, like use action state, use all the same hooks, but then pass it a function that just runs in PHP instead, like still re-implement all the form data API and all that. That would be kind of neat.
Yeah. See, it gets in your brain, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You're like,
I'm chewing on it now.
How do
you guys are talking about funny names and I'm still over here.
We lost him. That's great. Well, just open another PR and tell me how to do it. That would be awesome.
Yeah. What else are people like just using in Laravel world to build these types of applications? Because that was one of the first things we asked Taylor when we had him on. We're like, oh, awesome. Like Laravel is great. Like, what are you using to build Laravel Cloud's dashboard? And he's like, React,
React.
And like, if you want to build a experience like that, even the PHP guys are still reaching for React. Is that pretty common?
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. I think to Taylor's great credit, he's taken a very neutral approach to front-end tooling. I think we've seen some other back-end frameworks take pretty hard lines on, we're not going to do JavaScript, and if you want to, good luck, have fun. And I think Taylor is he's more of a pragmatist and realizes like, hey, these JavaScript front-end frameworks serve a purpose, and their purpose is great. And so we got to figure out how to make it work. So instead of saying no, and instead of inventing a front-end framework that nobody else outside of Laravel is going to use, Laravel has fully embraced these front-end frameworks through Inertia. And now that Inertia is in-house, they just recently acquired it off of Jonathan Rennick. Now that it's in-house, I think they can spend more time and energy to like make it even better for Laravel. And so on the one side, we've got lots of people using Inertia. I think people are potentially starting to choose React because of the IBM thing. It's like, yeah, it's just React. Everybody uses React. You can't get fired for using React. There's still a strong foothold of Vue in the Laravel community because that's kind of what we grew up on. And then we've got Livewire on the other side. So if you want to write a reactive front end, but not pick up one of these JavaScript frameworks, you can pick up Livewire. And Livewire goes a super long way in the same direction that a JavaScript framework does to give you that rich interactive front end when you combine it with Alpine JS. And it is meant to be combined with Alpine JS. They're by the same author. They work together really well. And so it's not like, oh, I got to do Livewire and then throw this thing on top. It's like, no. Livewire and Alpine kind of come together and allow you to build out these super rich interfaces without going into JavaScript land. And a lot of people don't want to go into JavaScript land. And so they're super well served by this Livewire, rich interactivity on the front end.
I'm curious, and maybe just on your personal thoughts and opinions on something like HTMX. I know there is HTMX Laravel integrations. I don't know if you've looked into any of that. What are your thoughts on that approach?
I am all for approaches, and this is my bias showing, that gives more power to the server. I like living in the server land. I like being on the back end. I like the ability to test things super well, keep state in a super clean place, not have to ship everything out to the client. So I like fundamentally HTMX, Live View, Livewire, these types of things. I think HTMX, I will admit, I've not played with it. I've watched, a lot of the Primogen videos about it, but I haven't actually played with it myself. But I think having a vision and pursuing it for a decade in the same direction is always going to get applause from me. He's been working on this for 1,000 years, and I love that. I think generally people could reach for things like HTMX for a lot longer than they do because, maybe they don't ever reach for it. But I think it takes you a long way in the right direction. I don't think it gets you fully to something like a Vue or a React, but I think picking up a full single page application or even a full Inertia kind of style thing from the beginning, unless you need it, that feels like a default that maybe shouldn't be the default. Maybe we should be leaning on some of the more back-end heavy solutions. But again, that's a preference thing. I like the back end.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, let's keep that going. You're Mr. Database. You got a bunch of courses on database. Used to work at a database provider. If you're building an app, you're obviously probably Vue, Laravel, but what database are you reaching for?
So again, that depends. So I think these days, you can get a lot further on SQLite than most people expect. I think SQLite is amazing. I think it is, in some ways, it is both underutilized and everywhere, right? So there are trillions of SQLite databases, probably, several dozen or hundreds on your iPhone alone, not to mention in your Chrome browser, everywhere. It's just freaking everywhere. But we haven't yet seen, and maybe we're getting there, but we haven't yet seen SQLite crack the web app space because of some of the fundamental limitations of SQLite, in that it is a file on your disk. And so that's a pretty big limitation. We've seen some people try to attack that, Terso with their libsql and their new Terso and stuff like LightFS, that kind of stuff. all really cool innovations around it. I think DHH is correct when he says you can scale up a single machine to, whatever he says, billions of dollars or whatever. But like you can scale a single machine way up and live on SQLite just fine for a super long time. I think the idea of pushing everything to serverless databases was a little bit of a fad in, the COVID era. It's like, hey, you could have a database that turns off. And you're like, but why? Why do I want my database to turn off? And so I think SQLite gets a bad rap. I think it is a lot more powerful. Then beyond that, once you do get to a point where you're like, no, I need 5 web servers and they all have to like talk to the same database and it's not like right here on the disk. Then you're at the question of MySQL and Postgres, and I think this is a spiritual battle. This is Vim, Emacs. This is Mac PC. It's like, what do you want? I think they both have things that are objectively better than the other, and I think they both have things that are objectively worse. I think Postgres has way more support for esoteric types and extensibility. And like all kinds of like you could run SQLite in Postgres. Why? I don't really know, but that's the extent to like Postgres can be extended to do literally anything. Redis has been re-implemented as, a Postgres thing. It's like, what are y'all doing? So I think that part of Postgres is amazing. It's rock solid, fully open source, been around for a million years, like tons of extensibility, tons of types, etc. Operationally, I think MySQL is easier to scale. And part of that is because it's dumber, right? It does way, way less. It doesn't have the connection per process thing. The reason that we see 15 to 20 Postgres service providers and one notable MySQL provider is because Postgres is fundamentally extremely extensible and you can do all this weird like hacking around with it. And I think MySQL presumably, or the company line is it's easier to scale out. But we've seen one company do it, and they've done it very well, but we've only seen one company do it, and I think that's because it's got warts. Like MySQL is not like the most pure implementation of anything. If you've ever like seen those Hacker News threads about like, y'all, I worked on MySQL, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I think those are real. But we have, we've got some experts that are up for running at RDS and then, the cloud hosting company. So it's not a very satisfying answer, but that's my database rant.
I'm curious more on the extensibility of Postgres. Like, what are some of the more common things that like are people just like reaching for plugins for the Postgres? Yeah, like what are some things?
PostGIS got to be number 1, 2, or 3.
That's for storing geolocation data?
Yeah, that's for doing all the Esri stuff, all the GeoJSON, the shapes, polygons, all of that stuff. Incredible support. Full careers are built around PostGIS. And I don't know what those people are called. They're not like DBAs, but they're basically like Esri developers or GIS developers.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they rely a lot on PostGIS. I think another example that we've seen recently is the proliferation of vector support for Postgres. So Postgres at this point has multiple vector plugins that you could use, where MySQL has one, and it is tied to PlanetScale. They wrote it, they've implemented it, nobody else has done it. It's on their internal fork of MySQL. I don't know if it's open source, but that's one of those things where like something new happens in the landscape, Postgres is going to get it first. They just are, because it's open, it's extensible, it's got this hacking culture, and there are, hundreds of Postgres, extension developers. Whereas for MySQL, it's like, good luck. I don't know of anybody that's done it besides PlanetScale. I guess Percona. Percona's probably up there as well.
Yeah, Postgres always spoke to me because I came from Mongo beforehand, and it's just like you can just huck whatever you want into Mongo. And then moving to MySQL, it's like, all right, it's just so many rules. I just want a JSON table here for something sometimes. I'm wondering, Wes and I just had a question actually earlier today in one of our potluck questions, and it was asking about database hosting. And you had mentioned that there were a lot of Postgres hosts. I've hosted on like Neon and a few others, but what are like, in your mind, the best places people should be hosting their Postgres?
That is a fair and tough question, because I think these Postgres service providers have realized that there needs to be differentiation, because just having a Postgres box at this point has become a little bit commodified, right? And so you see something like Supabase that's like, if you squint, it's just a Postgres provider. But if you open your eyes, it's like, oh, we're a full-on application backend. And you're like, whoa, well, that's fundamentally different. And so it kind of depends, like, on the scale of I need a place to put my database to I don't actually want a backend. That is the scale on which you can find Postgres providers. And so I think all the way at the left of I just want a place for my database, you've got stuff that like RDS, but I also think like Crunchy Data. Crunchy Data is a great one for, hey, we are the Postgres experts. We're the serious company that's like, we will take your mini terabyte database and make sure that it's okay. I got you. And then you go all the way to the other side and you've got stuff like Zeta, which, Zeta and Supabase and these people have like, oh, you want to do file uploads? Sure. That's something a database should do. And you're like, it's starting to kind of blur the lines between like a database and a backend as a service, which is not, there's no moral judgment there. It's just a business case of like, what do we want to be? And so then you see somewhere in the middle, Prisma's walking its way up from ORM to, hosted provider. And they're doing interesting stuff. I just talked to their CEO recently. They're doing interesting stuff with like running Postgres as a unikernel. And now unikernel is a word that I know. I learned that like 2 days ago. And so they're doing interesting things where it's like, hey, instead of running it in AWS, what if we went bare metal? And I'm like, whoa, you're going to like, people are going to be mad at you. And they're like, yeah, but what if we went bare metal and we, compiled Postgres to be a unikernel so that it's, better, faster, cheaper, we can pack it tighter. And so all of these Postgres companies exist on a spectrum, and it kind of depends like, what do you want? So that's the way that I break down the landscape. And of course, everybody fits in there somewhere along that spectrum.
Nice. Thank you.
Have you ever dipped into any of the like, I don't even know what you call them, but like big ass databases.
No, that's right. That's what you call them. Yeah, that's their official name.
BigQuery. Yeah, where they're like, you can store a lot of stuff in here, but there's a lot of limitations around how you can access the data.
Column DBS. Yeah.
Yeah. What is it? Cloudflare Workers has their analytics engine, which is built on ClickHouse, I believe. Have you ever dipped into any of those?
So to the extent that I've done one of these analytical or like columnar databases, I have only dealt personally with Single Store, which is kind of this like unholy mashup of like MySQL and a column-oriented database. And I found it to be incredibly performant, but you're right, there's all these weird caveats up front where it's like, you got to pick your shard key, and you're like, what's a shard key? I don't know what that means. But if you mess it up, you're totally hosed. So do it right the first time. So that was a little while back. I wrote the Single Store Laravel like driver not too long ago. But coming back to Laravel proper, they are launching soon a product called Nightwatch, and it is like a application performance monitoring, bug catcher, that sort of thing. And the team that is leading that, one of those team members is named Jess Archer, and she did a big talk at one of the Laracons about ClickHouse, and it blew my mind. The amount of like data that she was talking about them storing and not like breaking a sweat was shocking to me. So I have not personally gotten into any of the like big data databases, but I have read and watched a little bit about them, and they seem awesome. But that's as far as I've gone.
Yeah, it's a whole nother world for me.
It is. Yeah.
All right, running up on an hour here. Anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to touch on?
I don't think so. I think I'll just give the vision for Fusion, and that is that we can lower the bar for people coming into Laravel from the JavaScript community. So like, my goal is for this to be an on-ramp into the Laravel community and make it feel really familiar and like homey to the JavaScript developers. And so I'm putting a lot of like pain into what would a JavaScript developer expect here. And that is kind of guiding some of these API decisions. So if you are a JavaScript developer, come check it out. Give me feedback on what is stupid and what is very smart. Hopefully, give me a very smart before you hit me with a stupid. But I'm open to all advice.
All right, let's move into the last section of the podcast we have here, which is sick picks and shameless plugs. Did you come prepared with the sick pick?
I came prepared.
What do you have for us?
So I know that Scott has picked this before, but I've got a spin on it. So it's better display.
Yeah.
And so the spin is better display CLI. So I do a lot of video recording, a lot of screencasting, a lot of being on calls, that sort of thing. I've got these great giant monitors right here that are basically giant lights that light up my face. And if I push this button, you'll see really, really light up my face. But with better display CLI, you can write scripts that control the resolution, the brightness, everything. And I've tied it to a button on my Stream Deck so that when I get on a call, perfect, I can say, this doesn't look great. Let me better display and turn it down a little bit. So better display, but check out the CLI.
Man, I got to do that because every time we start to record, that's the first thing I do is I have to go to both of my displays, lower the brightness down. Otherwise, like especially glasses, brightness, everything. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. The worst.
Oh, man. Yeah, sick. You guys they got the same glasses, so you have the same problems of the reflection.
The affliction of the nerds, yes.
Yeah, man. Right, yeah.
The amount of pain I have trying to get my camera in the right spot, and I think, man, I'm glad I don't have glasses because that's just a whole nother level of
it's the worst
stuff thrown in there.
Oh, I recorded, I think, my first 3 or 4 courses with glasses that had no lenses in them because I just couldn't, I just couldn't figure it out. And so I had an old pair and I just popped out the lenses and that's 3 great. People ever noticed. It was a great little Easter egg.
That's so funny. I have to I have all this I'm in in a detached office. I have all this great natural light and then I have to block it all out. Otherwise, you'll just see the window reflections on everything. Yep. It's like, I got to block it all out and then re-add the light in a controlled environment. It's really love that natural light.
It's very hard to BS. That's what I'm taking away.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It is very hard.
By the way, I posted a photo of you guys on Twitter right now, and people do not believe that you're still not the same person. So
oh, that's fantastic.
It's so funny.
All right, last section we have here is shameless plug. What would you like to plug to the audience?
Sure. To the audience, if the database part intrigued you, we've got highperformancesqlite.com and masteringpostgres.com. Super in-depth, intermediate to advanced level material. And if the nerding out about screencasting intrigued you, we've got screencasting.com, which we're currently working on a refresh for. So you can find all of that stuff there.
That's awesome. Do you tell a story about how you got that domain? That's a great domain, screencasting.com.
It's the best domain, and the story is super short. It was available as a buy it now on GoDaddy. It wasn't $9.99. It was $5,000. But
okay.
I looked it up, and it was like, wait, I can just buy screencasting.com, and it's $5,000, and
just
it's
available.
Totally paid off. Totally worth it.
Wow.
100%.
That's amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
That's good. I always ask everybody how they got their domain name, and almost everybody's very cagey about it. I don't know why. I think people are doing some sketchy stuff to get their domain names, but
the way that I got AaronFrancis.com is my dad bought it when I was 7 years old.
Yes.
So
I've already done that.
That's
for my
the real
kids.
hack.
Yeah.
Do you own your kids.coms? Because I have all mine.
So, I had to get first, middle, initial, last because first, last was taken.
Oh yeah.
I know.
We only had one that wasn't available, kitboss.com, and turns out the person who owned it, her son, it was a Danish artist from Denmark, and her son watches my videos. So she sold it to me for a reasonable price.
Get out of here.
Free videos for life, yeah.
That's amazing.
I had a really hard time finding Talinsky domains. I'll tell you that they were all taken up. All the nobody in the world has. There's a Talinsky.com that is owned by some guy in Poland, and that's it, pretty much. So.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say, man.
Yeah, no, my kids were readily available. Yes,
that was gonna surprise me. I know I should have named my son Josiah or something, but Simon and Isaac are relatively common, and
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. That was really fun. We appreciate all your insights into everything, and hopefully everything goes well with the rest of your Laravel or Fusion for Laravel. Yes.
Dodge the attorneys again.
Yeah. Yes. I don't want the the Lambo showing up at my front door with a couple knocks in the middle of the night. Cool. All right.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it, y'all.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's great to meet you, Aaron.